Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode of Finding Me on the ITV networks. Khalil Gibran wrote, "To understand the heart and mind of a person, look not at what he has already achieved, but what he aspires to." And as I sat in the law faculty this week, I was intrigued by a saying that was plastered on the blackboard. It read, "It is not wrong to be different. It is wrong to be treated differently if you are." And that is going to be the subject of our discussion today. With me, I have Professor Abdi Samatar. He is a professor of geography at the University of Minnesota and a fellow at the University of Pretoria. Professor Abdi Samatar has also been awarded the Fulbright Scholarship twice. He has visited many universities, including Harvard and Oxford, and he is a founding member of the new Somali political party, Hil Quran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome, Professor.
Wa alaikum assalam, my sister.
It's very good to have you here, and I'm really excited because I think we have a lot to discuss. Somalia, as you know, is a very important topic of discussion for all of us, especially being in the Horn of Africa, and I think it touches the hearts of many Africans, and especially the South African people as well. Now, we have to start right at the start, and you are a geographer. And in most of your discussions, you speak about identity. Now, why is the concept of identity important to you?
I think, first of all, salam alaikum to your listeners, and good evening or morning whenever the program airs. I think identity is important not only personally but intellectually. It's important because people through history have been identified in certain ways which they themselves might not share. And so there appears to be a gulf, particularly in the post-colonial world, between what people think of themselves and what others think of them, as you precisely quoted in your introductory remarks about being different but being treated differently. And so you have a long history in the continent, in our continent in Africa, where Africans are told they are different from this, they are different from that, or they are different from this. But nobody ever asks them as to what they think about those ideas that others have of them. And hence I thought it would be worthy of my time to take on this as a research project, as an African, as a Muslim, as a Somali, and to see what has been said about my people in the Horn of Africa, what they think of themselves, and what are the implications of those different views about who Somalis are.
So perception basically filters into our understanding of ourselves. Very often perception that other people have of you can actually corrupt your own understanding of yourself. Doesn't that evolve in the identity conflict or crisis that happens, especially amongst Africans, and I think now also amongst Muslims?
Yeah, for me, you know, both Islam and humanism tells you there's something quite fundamental about all of us. And that is, we have outside our bodies, we have certain feelings, we have certain thoughts, we have certain appreciations, we have certain likes, and we have certain likes. I don't know of any human being who sits outside that campus. And so the question becomes, both as a Muslim, as an African, as a Somali, as a human being, is does others who want to characterize people and pigeonhole them in certain ways, have they ever looked into the mirror to see what they themselves look like and what others think about them? And so, as the Prophet ﷺ told us in many of his sort of sayings, that before you point the finger at others, do look at yourself first.
Yes, sorry, it reminds me of a saying, I think it was Musa alayhi salam. He said that it's easy to see the faults of others, but you can't see the log in your own eyelid.
That's
basically.
Precisely true. And so, for me, it just became, for instance, I was a doctoral student when the upheavals for liberation were taking place here in South Africa in the 80s. In the early 80s, I was. And I remember the famous South African Bishop Desmond Tutu coming to the Berkeley campus of the University of California. I think I was on my second to last year of the doctoral program. And we gathered in this huge amphitheater. It was outside building. And he spoke to us. And just that week, I read a book for one of my last seminars, which was talking about South Africa as this deeply divided society of sort of traditional Zulus versus the Xhosas versus the Afrikaners. And this American professor who at that point in time taught at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, was arguing that South Africa's best hope for peace is to have a federated state of tribes and nationalities. And I remember people asking the Reverend, the Bishop about this issue. And he smiled and he said, after all, we are all South Africans, we are human beings. And we had lived together under enormously terrible circumstances. And under democracy, we can do much better than that. And what's sort of fortunate is that the leaders of the liberation movement, broadly defined, refused to buy into that project, which said, we are going to politicize who you from your culture. In other words, Khoresha is a Muslim person. She is a lecturer at the University of Pretoria. And I'm going to take the responsibility of saying, this is who you are politically given your cultural background. What that does is to dehumanize the person and said, you don't have a capacity to think, because culturally, you share many things with Muslims, you share many things with your fellow citizens in South Africa that are cultural. But that doesn't define as to what you think about particular political programs, and therefore your political identity. So my brother and I, on certain issues, come on completely different sides of the equation. Right. My wife and I do the same thing, and my assumption is that my kids and I will do the same thing. So cultural identity is non-political, it's voluntaristic. Political identity is a state project, whether it's here in South Africa or in the United States or in Somalia. And so we need to distinguish that. And in order to be able to do so, then we give space to the humanity of the individual to be able to make up her mind or his mind about what they think about certain issues, rather than being said, you are a Muslim, therefore you think like this.
And we demarcate then, and we distinguish between each other. The sad part is that we focus too much on the differences rather than looking at what is common between us and what binds us, I think, in our humanity. Okay, now I have a question about your birth. You are Somali by birth. You are now in the United States of America. You lecture there, but you strongly held on to your Somali identity. So what is unique about the Somali people?
I don't know if there is anything particularly unique about the people of my origins. You know, one of the things I wrote a number of years ago was about a group of scholars, mostly Europeans and Americans, who have celebrated Somali differences, which are relatively minor, and who have refused to acknowledge the deep well of commonalities the population has. So I asked myself, what is their political project in digging into or accenting Somali differences and never ever talking about the sort of a wealth of commonalities the population has? I grew up in a sort of, I was born in a pastoral camp somewhere in the sort of mid-1950s. And my brother, who is older than me, who also is a professor in the United States, was the first child to go to school in our village.
First child? First
child to go to school in our village. I think I was the 160th child in that village. I remember my number. And one of the things my parents told me, particularly my mother, because my father passed away when I was in 4th grade, and so she became both mom and dad, and she was with us until quite recently, is that you come from a particular region of Africa, you come from a particular faith, Islam, And one of the things I want you to always remember, I remember that almost like a first grader, my mom telling me, that you are neither this nor that you are both of these things. And that you go out there into the world and make your own history.
Okay, Professor, I have to stop you there. We have to go for a break. When we come back, we'll pick up on developing a history and then, of course, looking forward to the present and the future. So after the break, we'll carry on this wonderful discussion with Professor Abdi Ismail Samatar. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me on the ITV networks. Today I have with me Professor Abdi Ismail Samatar, and he is a professor at the University of Minnesota, deals specifically with many issues related to culture, identity, but Professor is also specialized in geography. However, today our focus is on Somalia and the Somali identity, and of course then the related perspectives that come with it in the wider cultural society. And before we went into the break, we spoke about establishing our identity and a history. And Professor, you were telling me about your childhood in Somalia. And if you can then perhaps just elaborate a little bit more and carry us through to the Somali identity. And then I would like to go on to the discussion on the debate that you had in the British Tribunal. So we'll come back to that just now.
With pleasure. I think, so my mother and my parents in that pastoral camp, nomadic camp, were quite central to giving my brothers and sisters a certain center of our own gravity as people. And then one of the interesting things about Somali history is that while the British and the Germans and the Italians and the Portuguese were brutalizing Africans, there was a 20-year-long war of liberation at the turn of last century, from basically 1899 to 1921. And it was in Somalia for the first time the British used warplanes against the liberation movement. That was the only way they could defeat him. And one of the legacies of that history through our parents was that my parents told us that you are second to nobody. You are equal to everybody. And so there was a British commissioner in Kenya who was in the bush and saw a caravan of camels with a bunch of people, Somalis. And he asked his guide, he said, "Who are those people?" And the African person who was his interpreter and junior partner said, "These are Somalis, they are no good. Everyone is a sultan to himself." And so the war of liberation, long before Africans actually collectively began to engage in liberation struggles, Somalis were doing that. And then the idea that you are your own person and your people are their own people and they are second to none. It's a combination of the personal history of the family and the collective history of the population that gave me and many others, I think, a center of our own gravity. Even when I went to the States, African students were complaining about racism and this, and I said, what's the problem with that? Just take them on and do your homework and tell them where to go. And so I think it comes from that groundedness in both our own culture as Somalis, but also our faith as Muslims and Africans.
Yeah, but that definitely then makes you unique, even though you say you don't think unique, because I think the rest of Africa suffered from an inferiority complex after slavery and colonialism. It was always that the white man was superior, and it seems that the Somalis seem to have escaped that kind of an identity. But we'll come back to more of that. I just want to go now to the paper that you wrote, where you speak about debating Somali identity in a British tribunal. And in there you wrote, a farmer from the southern town of Johar re-invoked Timad's poetic explanations nearly 2 decades later, when he said, "Son, the tribalism business is the work of the urban people. They cook it there and then serve it to us." Now, this is a very important issue because it speaks about tribalism. And in quite a few of the interviews that I have covered recently, we looked at Sudan and we spoke a little bit about Somalia and Libya and of course Saudi Arabia, Campaign. All of the Muslim majority countries seem to be suffering from this issue of tribalism. And power is maintained, or they hold on to power simply because of different clannish understandings and tribes, and it's effectively what has destroyed the Muslim world, I would say, today. And yet it is something that the Prophet ﷺ strictly warned about when he said, leave your tribal customs and traditions, today you are all one. Now, there is a central and common identity amongst your people, of course, and that is Islam, right? And Islam is such a strong bond, I know, in Somalia, because the Somali people are an amazing and dignified people. But with such a strong bond, why is there so much of conflict in Somalia?
I think the first thing we need to understand is that the fall of Islam as a civilization, not as a faith, but as a civilization, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, these were the major civilizations of Islam since the Prophet, literally. And so with their fall came European colonialism, whether it was in a Muslim society or in non-Muslim societies, certainly in Africa and elsewhere. And one of the things they all did, colonial regimes did everywhere, is to figure, because they didn't want to invest in people's education, they didn't want to help people develop themselves and compete with them, compete with the British and the Italians and everybody else. So they looked for certain features of those cultures which they could use to exploit in order to divide and rule. So whether it was faith or the sort of different interpretations of faith in some of the Muslim societies, or whether it was the different genealogies of communities who literally share the same culture, but they have different genealogies, like this flower has a different genealogy from a different kind of a flower. And so they pegged on these things, and one of those things they did in the Somali case was genealogy, male genealogy, not family genealogy, but male genealogy, and therefore they appointed heads of communities. And those heads became the agents of the British, the agents of the Italians. That is how culture, genealogy as a cultural factor, became an instrument of the colonial political program. So divide people along those lines. They couldn't talk to one another, that's the Somalis, but they all could talk to the British separately from one another, because they didn't want, the British didn't want them to be united, or the Italians didn't want them to be united. So that's a key factor, I think, to understand where this political project, not a cultural project of tribalism, comes, whether it's in the Muslim world or in the non-Muslim African world. And so what then happens after independence is that I would argue there are two tendencies in the politics of any country. Those two tendencies, one is what I call communitarian and civic, and the other one is sectarian. Some people think that they have to get inside the state to line their pockets and to line the pockets of their followers, and that way they can remain prominent in the political process. Others are thinking more about the collective project of saying, we have a competition in this world, both as Africans and as Muslims. Europe is gone in terms of in terms of economic development. Japan is gone, the Americans are gone, so we have to catch up, but without giving up our own roots. And so they try to hold the population together in a quote-unquote, in many ways, democratic societies, which was the case in Somalia before the collapse, long before the collapse. And so it's these two tendencies that are fighting one another. What the Cold War does then, particularly Western Cold Warriors, is to support, by and large, those who were less interested in the collective interests of their communities and their countries, but who were willing to do the bidding for the Cold Warriors from England, from the United States, from Germany, and what have you. And it's oftentimes those who won. So if you look, for instance, at, let's say, whether it's Somalia or Angola or South Africa, the ANC, by and large, never got, the liberation movement never got any support from the West.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. If you look at Angola, the MPLA was not supported by, but Savimbi and UNITA were supported by the West, the CIA and the South African government and all of those things. So you see the continuation of the colonial project of investing in differences among people rather than their commonalities.
And I have to stop you there. We're going for our break again. When we come back, we'll take this further, and then of course come to the prevalence of the identity, and of course the partitioning, the aim of partitioning Somalia into a similar concept like that of the Bantustan. So we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the final segment of Finding Me on the ITV networks of the first episode with Professor Abdi Samatar. And before we went on the break, we were speaking about the conflict in Somalia and what has actually contributed to that conflict. And Professor, you highlighted, of course, the focus of divide and rule by fixating on specific differences with the people, yet they share very many commonalities. Now, part of this, of course, is the divide and rule, and we've seen it all over Africa, especially if you look at Nigeria and other states similar to that. You will see that the people eventually become so divided that the conflict then becomes permanent. But more important to me, of course, is that the vulnerable in society are the ones who pay the biggest price. And that would, of course, be the women and the children. Now, I want to ask you, how does conflict affect women? And do you feel that because Somalia has such a strong Islamic identity, that certain so-called religious practices, and then of course even tribalism and tribalistic influences, contribute to more harm for the woman in conflict-ridden societies?
I think it's very important, Gracia, to understand that we are, Muslims as people are basically human beings like anybody else.
Yeah.
And that when somebody reads Surah Al-Qari'ah, for instance, they will read it differently from one another, different interpretations. But I think what's quite fundamental for Muslims, if they want to remain true to the spirit and the word of Islam, is to develop a certain degree of tolerance and communal wholeness. What has happened over time in the history of our faith is that men who did most of the interpretations created a certain auras, most of it cultural rather than religious. And when the colonialists came, the colonialists were as patriarchal as anybody else. So they linked with the men, whether they were the men of the faith in terms of religious men, or the men of the culture in terms of tribalism and all of that stuff. And so, for instance, in the Somali case, when they began to build schools, I told you earlier that my older brother, was the first child in school in the village. They did not build schools for women, for girls. They built schools, and the two patriarchs, the Somali patriarchs who were Muslims, and the British or the Italian patriarchs who were Christians, were working together to develop men without necessarily looking how 51% of the population were going to become less than full citizens post-colonial project. And so in my mind, that is how this sort of, if you like, marginalization of our mothers and our sisters and our daughters began to take place. The tragedy, in my opinion, in the Islamic world is that those post-colonial regimes never quite reflects on the practices of the faith of the Prophet and his followers, but more or less copied the Europeans, okay? And so sustained the colonial project. My argument has always been in the Somali case, the people who lost the most in the civil war and the collapse of the state were women. At least in the sort of during both the military regime and the democratic era of Somalia. Their schools were being built for girls. My younger sister, again, was one of the first female children to go to school in the village which my parents took part in establishing. And so if we cannot understand that, then we cannot understand why women are ultimately made much more vulnerable than anybody else in those communities. The key here is empowering people does not mean you have to be arrogant, you have to be faithless, but that you have to have the capacity to take care of your family and your community. That entails access to education, that entails access to health, that entails access to jobs. And Muslims, in my mind, particularly those who are in power in this Muslim world, have miserably failed in providing the basic clues that hold those Islamic cultures together in a harmonious way. And that's why women and children pay the brunt of these wars.
And has this changed now in Somalia?
I think, one of the things I will suggest is that my wife, who is also here, who is a professor, writes about so many of these issues. And she may be much more acutely analytical and aware of this. But I'll tell you one thing. My mother and her generation in the village where I grew up, built a first, as far as I know, mosque built by women for women. And the reason why they did that in the village, when I interviewed them and I wrote about them, was that we don't want to be guests to our faith.
Okay, and Professor, I have to stop you there. So we come to the end of the first episode, and we will continue in the next episode. But I think it's very important as a parting thought to remember that we don't want to be guests of the faith. And I love this idea of a mosque built by a woman for women. As you know, I've always championed the right of women to attend the mosque. So in the next episode, we'll carry the conversation further with Professor Abdi Samatar. And of course, I would like to raise the issue of Al-Shabaab and many other things which I know, Somali piracy, etc. So please stay tuned and join us next week when we speak about these wonderful, when we have this wonderful discussion. So fi amanillah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until next week.